Hi everyone, welcome to 7.2. Today's class, we're discussing, the slideshow is moving too quickly. We're discussing recoil, state management, and we're revising context a little bit from yesterday. If you have skipped yesterday's class, today's class is going to be a little dilly-dally. Specifically, I'm going to rush through context because we've discussed it yesterday. And then we'll go through state management, what it is, and the library that we're going to use for state management today, which is going to be Recoil. This is a starter code for today, and this is the code to the slides. Feel free to go here, clone the slides locally. You don't really need the slides, but you do need this code base. So it's in the same repository / same organization in which our assignments are. So I'm hoping it's not too difficult to navigate here. Please clone this repository locally. You will need this very soon to understand all the things we're discussing today. All right, let's get right into it. Let's begin with context. We discussed this yesterday. Okay, state management is really hard in React, and especially if your application grows by a lot, you have to basically drill down a lot of props throughout your application. If you remember from yesterday, I showed you, okay, if you have a component 1 which has another component that it renders component 2, which renders two components as children, C3 and C4. If there is a state variable called count that's present here at the top, you have, and it needs to be used here and here. You need to drill that count variable down to C2, and C2 drills it down to C3 and C4. What is the problem in this? The only problem, that sort of the only high level problem I feel this has is, okay, it's syntactically very ugly. You have C1 which renders C2 and passes in count as a prop, and then C2 passes in count as a prop to C3. So on and so forth. This is what I called prop drilling yesterday. It's the ugly way to send down props down your component chain. And how did I say we can fix this? I said we can fix this. Firstly, why do you need to fix this? The reason you need to fix this is because C2 doesn't even need count. Its only job was to take count from the parent and send it down to both the children. That's slightly weird and ugly. So for that reason, I introduced the context API yesterday. Okay, specifically to solve this problem, React introduced the context API. And what happens in the context API? In the context API, you can define your state variables slightly outside your component tree. So count can be defined outside in what's called the context. And now whatever components want to use count, they can directly use count, and you don't need to drill it down from the top. That's the benefit of using the context API. This was what we learned yesterday. The syntax, if you remember, looked something like this. At a high level, this is the top level app component. Inside the app component, I had to put the context provider, which came from where? Which came from a separate file called context.js, inside which I defined / created the context. So this is the file in which I created the context variable. First thing I had to do was provide the context throughout my application. Ki haan bhai, this value, this state variable count needs to be teleported across all the components. And so I had to provide that count variable, and then wherever I wanted to use it, I could directly be like const count equal to use context, count context, which again comes from here. I did not have to drill, as you can see, I did not have to pass count here as a prop. It automatically reached here because I was able to teleport it from context.js. So what are the three things you have to do if you're using context? Define the context, provide the context throughout your component chain, and then whoever wants to use it can use the use context hook and get the current value in the count variable. Why is this good? This is slightly cleaner. You don't have to drill down count through your component chain. If you remember from yesterday, I said context lets you teleport state values to a distant children and helps you get rid of prop drilling. If you are using the context API, then you can teleport the variables. If your children are very close to the parent which need the state, that need to share the state, then there's no real benefit. ठीक है चलो, you are anyways going to pass it down as a prop. You use the context API. But if you have distant children, कि हाँ भाई, this guy needed a state variable, this guy needed a state variable, this needed a state variable, this did not, a lot of them did not. Then using the context API, you're able to get rid of a lot of ugly syntax of drilling down the props. You can simply use the use context hook here and get the value directly in the component. It makes it slightly prettier. If you look at it diagrammatically, this was our app.jsx, which rendered a count component, which rendered a count renderer component that would render the count, and a buttons component that would render two buttons, one to increase the value, one to decrease the value. The count variable was defined here, and using the context API, it was teleported here and here. I did not have to pass it down to the count component. If you want to look at the code, this code is actually present right here. So at this point, I would urge you to clone this code locally. So let's understand a little bit how context fix the problems it does, but what are the downsides of using the context API? What are the things it was not able to fix that state management tools like Recoil let you fix? So please clone this repository locally and open it in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to do the same, going to give you guys 30 seconds. More seconds. More seconds. Again, the code is present here. So please clone it or download it and put it in Visual Studio Code. All right. If you look at the code again, what did I say the component tree looked like? App.jsx renders a count component. If you go back to the code, you will see app does render a count component. We have, of course, wrapped it inside the provider, the count context provider. But if you comment this out for now for a second as well, the component tree looks like app renders count, which is exactly what I showed in the diagram here. App renders count. This is not great. Let's keep it full screen. App renders count, which renders count renderer and buttons. App renders count, and count renders this component right here and this buttons component right here. If you start this application locally, run npm install, followed by npm run dev, you can see a basic counter application. Increase increases the count, decrease decreases the count. Why is this slightly better than the approach we had before? Oh, not provide this. How did this work without this? Never mind. I will come back to this. I had commented this and it still worked, it seems. No, it did not work. Yeah, that makes sense. I forgot to save. All right. So this app is a basic counter application. And what is the good thing? I don't have to do this. This count variable directly reaches the count renderer, which is the component that needs to render the count variable right here. What does this component do? This component renders this number here. If I put a bold inside you will see the text becomes bold. So any thing that you have to update relating to rendering the count variable, you can put here. This became bold. All right. What is the problem in this approach? What is the shortcoming of the context API that state management fixes? Intuitively think a little. What do you think? What do you intuitively expect when you do the context API, when you do things the way we are doing here in this application? You might intuitively expect कि हरकीरत component 1, component 2, component 3, component 4, and this is the context that you defined in a different application, a different file, sorry. I know Harkirat, this is using the context API, the count variable, this is using it and this is using it. I know Harkirat कि यहाँ तो I have never put count. Never did I put count here. It was teleported from here to here. So you might expect कि Harkirat C2 should not re-render. Only C3 should re-render. C4 should re-render whenever the count variable changes, because these two are using the count variable. C2 never uses the count variable, and it seems like somehow Harkirat कि हाँ the state variable defined here being used here. So this should not re-render. I would assume that the context API gives you this optimization. But does that actually happen? I will repeat what I feel you should have expected by this point. The expectation should be that whoever is doing a use context count context re-renders whenever count changes, and whoever is not using it does not need to re-render because nothing in that component changed. But does that really happen when you are using the context API? Let's look at the code again. A context provider, count is initialized here. It is neither sent to this variable, in this component, nor does this guy get the count via this right here, const count equal to use context count, which basically means you are never using count here, right? You are never using count variable to render or to do anything else, to pass down, nothing at all. Then is there any purpose for this guy to re-render? No. But does it re-render? Let's see. Let's put a log inside. Count re-rendered. You can try the same thing on your side. Try to put a log in the count component and see if this gets called whenever you're increasing or decreasing the count. As you can see, bunch of count re-renders, basically it does. Which tells you that even though count is not being used here, this component is re-rendering, and that's not great. It would be nice if some other more fancier, prettier, more strict state management tool would come that would take away this problem of whoever is not using a state variable does not re-render. Only the people who are using the state variable re-render. State management libraries let you do that. So this is one popular interview question / thing to know. Okay, is the context API something that you use to make your application performant? Why do you use the context API? To make rendering more performant? The answer is no. To make syntax cleaner / get rid of prop drilling? The answer is yes. This is why you use the context API. This is not why you use the context API. Then Harkirat, what is the solution that gives you both this and this? And the answer is state management libraries that some really smart people have written. Now let's look at that next, unless there's something else I've missed in the slides. So go back to the slides. If you do not understand this syntax, try to go from the video from yesterday where we discussed context slightly in depth. All right. Problem with context doesn't fix re-rendering. only fixes prop drilling. This count component still re-renders even though it does not use the count variable through the context API. That's what context does, and those are the shortcomings of the context API. More specifically, the biggest shortcoming is even though this guy does not use the count variable or the count state variable through a teleport, it still re-renders even though this and this is what should re-render, this guy should not re-render. Let's understand how state management makes that slightly better. Before that, what is state management? It is a cleaner way for you to store the state of your application. Until now, the cleanest thing you have done is to use the context API. It lets you teleport state. But there is a better solution that gets rid of the one problem that context API has, which is the unnecessary re-renders. Cool. This is generally a good framework to have in mind. Okay, your components and your state should be defined in two separate places. The whole point of React is, in fact, there was a time where people would, one second. The hell? Okay. There was a time when people thought, okay, there should be two different types of engineers in a front-end team. There should be like a UI engineer who's writing component, and there should be another engineer who's just maintaining state. Any React code base can actually be divided into two big parts. Okay, bhai, this code base has all the state logic and all the component logic. Until now, we had shoved the complete state inside the components only. So there was no real distinction. It was very hard for, an engineer who only knows HTML to not deal with state. But now, with the state management library that we are introducing, or any state management library, you will see very clearly how you can have a very nice separation of concern. And the UI engineer, the person who only knows HTML, CSS and JavaScript, can worry about the component logic. And another engineer who's a little more mathematical, understands state, understand how you propagate state, understand how to make backend calls, can worry about the state and then, gluing them together. So a lot of times you will see that companies will, open source just their components. Okay, bhai, anyone can work on this, or, anyone can look at our design system. Anyone can look at how our components are written. They cannot look at the state logic in our front end. So this part, just Razorpay has open sourced their design system. Basically contains all of their buttons, components, all this logic. They will never open source their state logic that actually, puts things on various places on a website. This is why it's a good idea to keep them separate, and state management libraries let you do that. We will see very soon how from now on, if you are using Recoil or any other state management library, you will define all your components in a separate folder. You will define all your state in usually a separate folder called the store. And independent engineers can work in independent folders. More specifically, a UI engineer who only understands, let's say, margin padding CSS does not have to worry about state. All right, let's proceed here. Recoil is the state management library we are using. A state management library for React written by, I think, some ex-React folks. I could be wrong. I think this guy right here is some big shot in React. The other popular ones are Zostand and Redux. They are all popular. Really depends on what project you're using. Everyone has every project has their own set of nuances. If you know Redux, it's not very easy. It's not like you will know Recoil immediately. Similar to if you know React does not mean you will understand Vue automatically, right? So they have their own nuances. You have to go through the docs once. But framework wise, they just let you divide your whole project into two parts, state and components. This is a very nice video, the introductory video to Recoil. Would urge you to go through it if you want to understand how Recoil makes itself so performant. And Recoil was introduced 3-ish years ago, I think. Usse pehle, Redux was the popular way to do things. And then now these guys came and sort of became very popular. So if you want to, this is a nice video that gives you a high level overview by the creator of Recoil as to how it becomes extremely performant. All right. Cool. Recoil has the concept of an atom to store the state. An atom can be defined outside the component and can be teleported to any component. The first thing you have to learn if you're learning about recoil, not state management, just recoil, is that recoil has the concept of an atom. As you can see, it says atoms here. Atom basically means this is the smallest unit of state, hence an atom, that you can define ki, this is my count, or this is my user information, or this is all the to-dos for my user, so on and so forth. And you can define a state. It's similar to use state. Rather than using use state, you would create an atom to store your state, and then there are a bunch of APIs around it as to how you can use that atom. But what is the first thing we need to understand if we want to get into recoil, or 90% of where all the recoil work happens, is creating atoms. An atom is similar to the use state hook that we've been using. This also lets you define a state variable. This also lets you define a state variable in the recoil world. This state variable you can update. This state variable you can update. How would you update this state variable? You would call the set count variable that you get back when you define the use state. Here also there is a way to update the state variable and get the state variable. The biggest importance of atom is okay, now you can define your component tree however you want. C1, C2, C3, C4. And your atom will always be defined outside in a different file, in the same file also, but generally a good idea to have it in a different file. Let's say this is your count atom. You can give it a default value here itself, okay, bhai, count is initially 0. And then you can be like, okay, bhai, I am going to use this value here and here. And why is this good? Can you guess? The reason this is good is okay, only this will re-render and this will re-render, because these are the only two components that are using the count variable. No other component is using it. No other component will re-render. This also does not need to have it. This also does not need to have it. That's the benefit. One of the many benefits of using a state management library. Other benefit is, as it says, state management in the name, which basically means it lets you manage state really well outside of your main component logic. All right. As I said, any open source project, any general good code base, if you look at, if it uses Recoil or even Redux, you will see a separate folder called store where they store all their, Recoil or state management logic. All right. Let's proceed. If we have time at the end, I can show you like a project or two where I can show you this is the separate store folder where all the state management logic is written. All right. Now let's migrate over our application to Recoil. Would urge you to run an npm install Recoil in the code base that you have cloned locally. And then let's go from there and introduce Recoil to this code base. All right. Take your time and install Recoil here. I'm going to give you guys 20 seconds. All right. Let's look at the APIs / functions that we need to worry about if you want to learn Recoil. This is a decent list of things that Recoil exports that you need to know of. Recoil root, atom, use Recoil state, use Recoil value, use Recoil set state and selector. Let's go through them one by one as we build our application. What is the current state variable our application uses? If you look at the application again, it just has one state variable, that one dynamic thing which translates to a state variable, which is what? The current count, which goes up or down as you click on these buttons. Now we need to define an atom. Rather than defining it like this, we are going to define it using Recoil by creating an atom. Let's do that next. Feel free to create a separate file if you want. You can write all of this logic here as well. But generally a good practice is you either have a folder called store, inside which you have another folder called atoms, inside which you define all of your atoms. I'm going to define JSX here. Would urge you to do the same. If you want to do it here, it's fine. If you want to do it in a different folder, that's fine. If you want to do it in this file, you can do that as well. It'll not be any different, but I'm going to do it here. Generally good practice to do it here as well. Going to wait for 10 seconds for you guys to create folders and create a count.jsx file. All right. Next up, we need to define that atom. Again, it is similar to this use state. We have to define a single atom. This is going to store my counter information. Let's just define it first. We'll export it later. Const count atom equal to atom, which you can import from Recoil, and give it 2 arguments inside an object. So atom expects a single argument as an input, which is an object. And this requires a bunch of keys you have to pass. The first one is key itself. Basically means a unique way to identify this atom. I'm going to call it count atom. And then default value, which is what do you want the default value of this specific atom to be. Harkirat, what does this key signify? It basically signifies how do you uniquely identify this atom. Basically, if you create a bunch of, let's say you have a very big application where you have a bunch of atoms, to-do atom, make sure this key is different for the to-do atom. You can name it whatever you want. Usually I just name it the same as the variable here, but you have to make sure you don't have conflicting keys for two different, the same key for 2 different atoms. That will create problems in your application. All right. I've defined the count atom and I'm going to export it as well. That's all I did. I have separately defined my state. My main project no longer needs state. My main project, app.jsx, does not need a use state variable, does not need a use context. I can get rid of everything. And I've defined all the state in a separate folder called count.jsx. 10 more seconds. Feel free to rake in the syntax. If you want to learn it yourself, try it yourself. It's very easy syntax already available here. So if you go to Recoil, get started, it'll guide you through the instructions. And here, as you can see, the same syntax is present here. Const text state equal to atom, key text state default empty string. So for these guys, it was some text variable that they want to store in an atom. For us, it is a counter variable. That is why our default value was 0. Their default value is something else. All right, we've defined it. Now we need to use it. Go back to app.jsx and get rid of all context logic, get rid of all state variables that you have defined. So get rid of this, get rid of this provider. Get rid of set count as well. This basically anywhere count is being used or set count is being used, we are going to replace it with the recoil logic. All right, cool. I have gotten rid of it. If you haven't yet, it's fine. You can slowly and steadily. Now notice that app has no state variable declarations, does not use a use state, does not have a count variable, nothing. Neither does count, neither does count renderer, neither does button. What did I say a while back? How are we going to structure your application? If you remember, I said these two guys, C3 and C4, will get things from the outside. Neither this nor this need to worry about the count or the set count or any state variable. That's exactly what we are going to do next. App does not have any state variable. Count does not have any state variable. The bottom two components need, this guy needs count, this guy needs set count. Let's see how we can build those. The syntax that you need to know of next is, if I go back to the slides, use recoil state, use recoil value, use set recoil state. These are three APIs we need to get comfortable with next. Let me quickly share what they do. If you remember, how does state work? You get a const count comma set count equal to use state 0. You have two functions that are one for getting the state, two for updating the state. Similarly, recoil gives you value to access to three hooks. Use recoil state. This is exactly the same as use state, which basically means it gives you two things, one the current value and one how to update the current value. But it has two more. It has one called use recoil value, which basically gives you just the value. So you don't need to create an array. If you just want the value and you don't worry about updating the value, you can use recoil value. And similarly, the third one is use set recoil value or set recoil state. I'm unsure. The one that uses set. This will give you the second one. Okay, if you only want to update a variable and not actually get the value, you can use this. So it gives you access to three. One that gives you both of these, one that gives you just this, one that gives you just this. You can pick and choose, okay, what does your component need, and accordingly use the right hook. In the worst case, if you don't want to worry about this and this, you can simply use this. This is enough because this is the same as what this guy returns you. All right, let's go back here. What does count renderer need? It needs just the value. It does not need to worry about how to update the value. There is no updation logic here. So what hook would I use here? I would use recoil value. I just need the final value of the count variable, and inside I will pass the atom for which I need the value. Okay, haan bhai, I need the value for the count atom. This is how I get it. This is different from if I did this. If I need both of them, then I will use recoil state. But I just need the value, so I can use this. Harkirat, why even need this? This is enough, right? I will just ignore the second variable. I will always use this. Yes, but later I will show you how this gives you some performance benefits, and you should, based on what your component needs, only get that much value. You should not get both of them if you don't need both of them. If you only need one, you should just use that specific hook that gives you just that one. All right. Got the count here, render the count here. Take 10 seconds, 20 seconds, write this code on your side. Nothing much I have changed. Let me make this smaller so everything fits in the same screen. The only change I've made is gotten rid of all the context logic. This simply renders count. This simply renders both of these. And these guys now worry about state management, get the state value and render it right here. 10 more seconds. Try to do the same thing on your side. Sir, count atom is not exported. It is. Just add an export here if you haven't done that. Link to the project that is being done is right here. No. This is the link. All right. This is done. Buttons component. Can you guess what needs to be used here? What does this guy need? It needs the count and it needs set count, both of them. So what hook should I use here? Should I use this? Use recoil state with the count atom. Is our application done? I think so. I think it's done. I don't think there's anything else. There are some optimizations that I will show you, but this is enough for you to create a basic recoil application which renders these counters. This is a very simple application. As you get into creating a to-do application or something else, this will get a little harder. We'll create a few more use cases today. I think we have time. We can get into the depths of other projects, but at least this project clear end to end, and let's add some more optimizations here to make it slightly more performant. But hopefully this is not too difficult. Defining the count atom and using the count atom directly in the count renderer and the buttons component. If you save it, you will see one error. I will show you what that error is. There's one thing we have missed until now, but first digest all of this syntax. I'm going to give you guys 10-15 seconds to write it on your machines as well. It will break right now. There is one small thing we need to fix, but at least syntax hopefully is clear. How we have gotten rid of all the use states is clear. How we have defined our state separately is clear, and we are just using the state wherever need be. All right, 5 more seconds. All right, the last thing that we have missed is this recoil root component. Just how the context API, when you're using, you have to use the provider. If you remember from a few slides ago, I said the count context.provider needs to wrap everything that needs to use the state logic. And similarly here, if your app, wherever you want to use any atom logic, any recoil logic, you need to wrap that inside a recoil root, which comes from recoil again. This is the last thing we had to do. Do you need this div? No, you can get rid of it. Harkirat, if I keep it outside or inside, does it matter? Does not matter. As long as the final component that is using state, which in this case is this guy and this guy, as long as they are wrapped inside a recoil root, you are fine. You can actually, if you want, really just move this here as well. Because count does not use any recoil logic, so it won't fail. Anything that uses a recoil logic, anything that gets a use recoil value, for example, count renderer, needs to be wrapped inside recoil root. So usually you do it at the top. You don't really, go to the bottom and then do it. In your app.jsx, you will see 10 different providers in most big applications, because there are other sort of libraries that also use /need to wrap your main component. So in the future, we'll see this app is a very big nested thing, but for now we just need one, which is the recoil root. Now test this application locally, and hopefully the application works the same and is a little more performant. I'll show very quickly how it's performant, but are we good? Do we understand the syntax? We'll see how it's more performant, but it's more cleaner, right? And you are not defining a state here, passing it down, drilling it down. Look at the logic. Count render, buttons. No props you have to worry about. All the props or all the state values come directly inside the component. Harkirat, does this mean that I should never use state? I will always put everything in atoms. No. There are cases where use state makes sense. Specifically, if you want to define a state in a component and use it there only. For example, when we defined, a basic input and did a on change equal to set input value e dot target dot value. If you remember this from the assignments last week, where we had an input button that would filter a few strings or some other use case, here there's no point of defining this input value in recoil. If you know a state variable needs to be defined and used inside the same component, or maybe like just one child needs it, you'll have to sort of, pick and choose basically. But the state usually contains very global state. Like in case of LinkedIn, it will be the notification count, the posts, the messagings, all these things. It will not be this, ki haan bhai, you need this input value to finally, hit a backend or whatever. This, it does not make sense to store in the recoil store. So does not mean that you never need use state anymore, but for your global states, by global states I mean the thing that actually creates your application. This does not really create your application. This is just an input value. Okay, person is putting something in the input box. you store it in an input, in a state variable. Here you would use useState, but all global variables, you would not use useState. All right, let's do a poll here. Do we understand this? Are you able to follow along and create this locally if you were? Right. Okay. Good, not great. 80%. So I'll answer a few questions and we will restart at 8. So 14-minute break and mess break. And I'm going to answer a few questions. Opening chat now. Please keep the questions related to all the things we have learned until now. Chat is open. Okay, a few people are saying just let me push the current code base over. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I've pushed the code base. Someone said, we did not write any JSX code in Atoms. Can it just be count.js? I think it can. Yeah. I think so. Let's see. Maybe not. Let's see. Basically, I'm unsure. Default value inside object is like defining the initial state. Yes. We did not answer that. Please make screen layout before it was better. Screen layout. What does that mean? This seems to work, by the way. You can make this count.js, does not need to be JSX. When will we discuss custom hooks? I think we barely touched this topic last week. Yeah, we can do it today if you want. I mean, frankly, yeah. Let me write this down. Yeah, let's. Oh, sorry, wrong group. Yeah, we can discuss it today at the end. Nahi to I will create an offline video. Why not Redux? We've been using this for a while. A lot of open source projects use it. Most open source projects I have seen at least use it, so that's why I'm doing it. When we can do Redux later down the line if need be, but this is part of the. Okay, answer that. Why did we not write any? Okay, answer that. But why are we learning Recoil? Why not Redux? Don't say I don't know. I mean, it's not don't know. It's like what project uses Redux? Give me one good project that uses Redux, and if we want to understand that project, then we will understand Redux. Any open source project that I have looked at, especially the ones that will come in 1 to 100 when we're looking at good open source code bases, they all use Recoil. So if we don't cover Recoil, you will not be able to understand the logic there at all. That's the only reason. I am stuck at this error. Atom is not a function. Are you importing Atom from Recoil at the top of your file? Recoil hasn't gotten updates in any time. The libraries are constantly updated. So is it future proof? Good question. I have not followed how updated Recoil is, and if that's not the case, then we can learn a different one. Someone recently was saying Zoostand is the best one. I don't know. Everyone has some nuance when it comes to the syntax, so we can learn a different one if need be. We had any way to pass set count function as props children. How does that get any better using context API? We anyways had to pass the set count function as a props to the children. How does that get any better using the context API? Oh, that's because we did that. If you go back to yesterday's class towards the end, I showed a way in which you can actually, you can basically pass down set count via the context API as well. When you're defining your context, const count context equal to create context, you can create an object here which has both count and set count, the default values of which are this. And then whenever you're providing the context, you can be like context.provider value equal to count set count. So that way you can teleport both count and set count down to wherever you want. I did not do that yesterday to keep things simple, but it's an object, right? I mean, if you make this an object, you can pass on whatever you want. How to use between this? Oh, they are future proof. For most applications, all of these will work. Like there's no need to worry about what is better, or like if one has a shortcoming for your application. Every project, be it Recoil, Redux, or Zustand, will do what you want to do. The only thing is what is more easy to hire for. That's what companies look for. What is more easy to maintain, what is more performant. Future proof, well, yeah, I don't think you worry about this too much. And if you ever want to, you can write it in a way so that it's very easily flippable. Okay, you define your store a certain way, or you expose the final things from here via hooks, which I can share later. You basically create custom hooks that your main application uses. So all those custom hooks will be like use count, or use to dos. And then if you ever want to flip, you can change the logic here and here. Your main application logic, basically app.jsx, never changes. Only you make changes in your stores when you ever want to flip from Recoil to Redux to wherever. So that's one way people keep sort of try to remain independent of the framework. Can we start team-wise Q&A or interactions? Yeah, let's do that. Team-wise Q&A. There will only be one per subgroup, but let's start that. Maybe this week only. Use recoil state versus use set recoil state. Yeah, so we will see this very soon. When we'll see how we can make one specific component performant, I will share what use set recoil state does. What if we use proper state management in our application, then I believe we don't need to use any hooks. We started recently. Is that true? Yeah, but as I said, you do need, right? If I introduce this input component here, you need use state. You definitely need use effect. Not definitely, you can get, if you want, you can, if you really want, you can not use memo, use state, use effect, but you should not want to use them. There are cases where you will need them as well, or where you should use them. Can you get rid of them completely? Yes. Should you? No. If it is true, then what is the use of hooks? I mean, React defined these hooks only. First React came, right? React introduced use state, use effect, use memo. Then Redux came. The question might be, why do you need HTML, CSS, JavaScript today? Because HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Why do you need? Because React is here. Why do you need HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Because React still uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These guys still under the hood might need these hooks. I'm unsure they do. Pretty sure they do. But more than that, just because you have the state management library doesn't mean you should not use these. Can we build in style enterprise application using Munstack? Yeah. Why not use callback in set count? Then no need of use recoil state. Yeah, that's what I'm going to share very soon. Yeah. When I reach the performance bit, I'll share exactly that. In the context API, couldn't we use react.memo to stop re-rendering? No, I don't think so. Let's see. Pretty sure you could not, but let's see. Let's do that experiment at the end of the class. It'll take like a few minutes to revert, but I'm pretty sure you will still see the re-render if you use memo, because I think context still propagates things via the props. I could be wrong, but I think so. Let me know. In fact, we will start again Next.js. Does Next make React easy? No, you basically need React to do Next. What to do learn after we're done with the assignments? Build a few projects. At this point I can share a few projects that you can build, which are not styled because we have not reached Tailwind, but you can build a few projects already. We did not write any. Okay, answer that. We can use the previous value in the counter enter. Yes, we can. I'll share that very soon. In the buttons component, can't we just use exactly? We will. Which is the most performant? Use state or recoil? What is more performant? The answer is not about what is more performant. The question really is, recoil lets you avoid a few re-renders because you're using the state here only, versus use state does not. That's the benefit. Now, which one is faster? I don't know. Which one is inherently faster? No idea. Why are we learning? Okay, answer that. Okay, we have a few more minutes. The opening chat again. Any specific questions related to the syntax or? Okay, a lot of questions. Count component still re-renders when using recoil. Should it not? Count should not. It should render once, but not re-render again. We'll see this very soon. But if it's re-rendering for you, something is a little weird on your side. Redux, I don't know which is better. Just use whatever you want, if I'm being honest. Whatever the project uses that you're trying to contribute to. Video side में ही ठीक था आपका मुखड़ा आपके मुखड़े का अच्छा कुछ लेआउट में चेंज हुआ है. दिस इज अ डिफरेंट. I think the Zoom layout has changed, which unfortunately I don't see because I'm not on Zoom. But let me write this down. Can you explain how to give post request using Axios? Basically, I want to do. I mean, it's as simple as Axios.post, send the URL, whatever your URL is, comma, send the body or data, one of these two. I'm forgetting almost only body, and you have to send whatever you want. Still rendering all. We'll see. Shouldn't be rendering all. If it's still rendering all, either you have some error or I have some error. It should. I mean, it will render everything once, of course, but like it shouldn't re-render them on clicking the button. Please upload it TS Next.js for cohort 1. Okay. Next I have already uploaded. I will upload TS. I know. Password is fine. वो पता ही है सबको. Companies choose between Redux and Recoil, right? On what basis do they choose? Yeah, I don't have a good answer to this. It really depends on the maintainer of that company or CTO of that company, whatever he is. Usually it is whatever he has done in the past, he's more comfortable with, so he just shoves that in the code base without worrying too much about performance. Is it possible to make API calls like Redux? Yes, there is a way to do direct API calls here. If we get the time today, I'll share very soon, but you have to use something called selectors, which we'll come to very soon. How is concurrency issues handled in use state? Is it concurrency issues through function calls? What do you mean concurrency issues are handled here? What if two people try to update the state together? The last one overrides. Where to use set recall state? We will see very soon. Is this using use state under the hood? I don't think so. I could be wrong. I don't think so. Depends on from the video that I had seen a few years ago of Recoil. I don't think they use state under the hood. I could be wrong. Maybe they do. I have no idea. Sign up component has 3 fields. Sign up component has 2 fields. Should I create state variables for both differently? So ideally, in your case, you should use a library like React Forms or Formic, React Form Hooks, React Hook Forms. This is the library. You ideally, if you want the real ideal situation, you should use one of these libraries because they make what you are doing right now is you are defining state variables, which you can do either. Does not matter. If you want to define 3 different ones, does not matter. But that will cause re-renders anytime the user inputs something on the keyboard. If you want to avoid that, a few people have written like libraries that are specifically meant to make forms very performant. So if you're really looking for the ideal solution, it should be this. In your case, does not matter. I mean, if you create 3 state variables, create a single object, does not matter. If I want us to start to use Recoil, how do you create? Bhai, bahut zyada typos hain yaar. Your video is not visible at full screen. Can you change the? Oh, okay. Now I get it. Seems like you guys cannot. Can you guys not see my face when I'm screen sharing? Oh, question was wrong. Yes. Now we can see. Okay, makes sense. So let's change the layout here. Zoom share your own video when screen sharing. One second, let me fix that. Zoom is not sharing my camera when I share screen. Okay, I can do one thing here. New. Okay, 1 second guys, almost done. I don't want you guys seeing me twice, but is this what we wanted? Can you guys see me now while I'm sharing my screen? Are we good? Yes or no? Are we good? Shall I proceed? Is the problem fixed? Is the problem fixed? Yes or no? Are we good? I see a combination of doing a quick poll here. I hope you guys are not seeing me twice now, which is going to be a pain. Are we good? Yes or no? Can you see me well now? Shall I proceed? Yes or no? No. Oh God. Okay. Close this. Are we good now? Shall I proceed now? Are we good to go? All right. Cool. Things were right then. Okay, cool. Chalo ji. Let's proceed. A few people suggested a few things in chat, which is what I'm going to share now as well. Number one, we should check, has this made our application performant or not? So let's go back to this count component. And here, if you remember from the last slide or when we were using the context API, this would re-render even though this and this were the ones that were using the count variable. Let's see if that problem is fixed now that we're using the context API. Sorry, now that we're using Recoil. All right, let's go here, open console. It does render once, but if I increase and decrease, it is no longer rendering, which is great. This component is now no longer re-rendering, which was the original thing that I proposed. Ki haan bhai, we know ke this was the thing that I proposed a while back. Ki only this guy and this guy needs the state management library or the value of count, and only these guys should re-render, and that is exactly what is happening. C2 has stopped re-rendering, as you just saw, because it is not using count, and Recoil is smart enough to re-render only the components that are using the count variable. But there is still one small problem here. We can make it slightly more performant. The problem is, if you look at the buttons component, which basically renders what? It renders the increase button and the decrease button. If you look at this button, it does not really need count. If you remember, it just needs to update it, right? It does not need to show it here or here. And if you remember, I shared two ways to set state. I said either you can do a set count of count plus 1, or you can do set count, get the current value, and return the updated value given the current value. Both of these syntax do the same thing. And if this syntax feels weird, all three of these things do the same thing. And the second and the third option do not require count to be present here. You can simply call set count, pass in a function, and the function will receive count as an argument whenever the set count function gets called, whenever the re-rendering triggers, and you can use it directly. You don't need count here. Why is this beneficial? Why is this something I'm suggesting that you do? The reason is because even buttons does not really need to re-render. If I'm clicking on this, this is the thing that is changing. Only this component should re-render. Why is the buttons component re-rendering? How do I know the buttons component is re-rendering? One, to kya I am taking out the count value here from use recoil state. So of course Recoil is smart enough to, re-render buttons. Re-render buttons. If I put this log here, if I refresh as expected, buttons re-render when I click on a button whenever the value updates, but ideally it should not. Ideally, I should replace this set count with this. Basically make these functions. Again, these are arrow functions. This syntax might feel weird. You can use this syntax as well. Both will do the same thing. And rather than using use recoil state, what do I want? I just want set count. How can I get that? Const set count equal to use set recoil state course atom or whatever count atom. And I don't need this anymore. Now, since I am not getting the value of count here ever, this will also stop re-rendering. If I put a log here, and look at the buttons component now. This guy only needs to set the value, does not need the value. It will automatically get the value whenever this function gets called. And hence, if I refresh now and click on increase or decrease, you will notice the buttons component has stopped re-rendering. No more unnecessary re-renders. Only the thing that is actually using the value of count is re-rendering. And for the people who are asking about the second hook, this is what the second hook does. Use set recoil state. It gets you the set count variable, which you can use. You don't need the count, and hence this is a slightly better syntax of achieving this specific application. This is as performant as this application can get, right? Because the most expensive part of React, which is updating the DOM or re-rendering, which I've kept on saying you need to minimize the number of re-renders, is only happening for this component now. It's not happening for anything. Neither is happening for app, neither is happening for count render. It's not happening for app, it's not happening for count, it's not happening for buttons. It is only happening for count re-renderer, which is why this is as performant as this app can get. This app gets, and this is how you use set recoil state. Now we're done with all of these. Recoil root, the thing that I said you need to put at the top of your app.jsx that actually propagates the state. Atom, how you define a single atom. We have a very simple application right now. As this becomes more complex, as if you have user information, if you make a user login, sign up to your website, if you have to-dos, if you have a LinkedIn like application, you'll have basically 10 different atoms which store the state. You'll store arrays as state as well, very similar to how we're storing like a number as state right now. Use recoil state, use recoil value, use set recoil state. All three of these you should pick and choose based on what you need. Do you currently need the value of count? Do you need to only update the value of count, or do you need both of them? Based on what you need, you should call the right hook. And lastly, the one thing that is left now is selectors. And for that, I'm going to keep this mildly assignment driven. Let's say I ask you to render it is even if the current count is even. Can you try to solve this yourself? Person will click on the increase and the decrease button. Whenever the final value is even, render it is even here. If it is not even, then don't render anything. You don't have to render it is odd, but you have to render it is even if the current value here is even. Okay? Try this out yourself. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Try to solve this specific solution yourself. If you can, go through documentation of Recoil and understand selectors yourself. I would urge you to do that. If not, do it however you would do it without any knowledge of Recoil. All right, back in 2 minutes. All right. Let's begin with the ugly way of doing it. The ugly way is what? I'm going to maybe right here below the count be like, maybe let's create a new component, call it even count renderer. And this guy is going to take get count and be like, if count is negative, count modulo 2 is 0, then render it is even, else don't render anything. Or you can also put null here. I'm unsure if we have discussed this syntax until now, but this is, one way to do conditional rendering. Okay, if this condition is met, then render it is even, else render null. You can also, if you want to do something like this, if count modulo 2 is 0, return it is even, else return nothing. Whatever syntax you're more comfortable with. If you feel this is more comfortable, if you like to write if else like this works for me. If you want the more fancier syntax, this is the more fancier syntax of doing the same thing. All right. I did not introduce selectors. Same thing we did until now, I'm doing again. And if I go back, here it is even, goes away, it is even, goes away, it is even, goes away, so on and so forth. This is good. But Recoil introduces this concept of selectors. Let's look at what they are. Let's go here. Basic tutorials selectors. A selector represents a piece of derived state. You can think of derived state as the output of passing a state to a pure function that derives the new value from the said state. This line is super important. Until now, if you might remember, we had introduced use memo in a few places, or use callback. We said you should use memo. I said you should use memo whenever you have a derived state, whenever you know, there is something that you want to derive based on some dependencies, for example, count. You should use something like this. In fact, if you look at the code base right now, it is slightly unoptimal. I'm basically doing this. Const is even equal to count modulo 2 is equal to 0. And then here I'm rendering whatever. Is this right? Or should have I done this? Const is even equal to use memo. Return count modulo 2 equal to 0 and count is a dependency. This is the better way of solving this problem and not this. Whenever you have a derived state, you use memo so that it's optimized and it only re-renders when count changes. If you want to do the same thing in Recoil, you have the concept of selectors. Okay, bhai, if you know something is directly derived from a bunch of dependencies, use a selector. And in our case, that is the case. Is even completely depends on count. If count will be even, this will be true. If it will be odd, this will be false. So rather than doing this or even this is actually good enough. Whatever optimizations you get here is what Recoil is going to provide you. But if you don't want to use memo and delegate whatever optimization this gives you, what is the optimization that this gives you? The optimization that this gives you is if a re-render happens and count has not changed, then is even will not run this expensive operation. I hope we understand that via use memo until now. Okay, this logic will only run when count changes. Similarly, you can define a selector when you know something completely depends on another state variable. Let's look at how you can define your selector. Right next to atoms, if you want, you can create a folder called selectors. I'm just going to go into count.js and define my selector here itself. Export const even selector equal to selector, which again has a name, which I'm going to give it even selector, and then get. This will be a slightly weird syntax, but I'll explain this very soon. Const all right. This is how you would define a selector that depends only on count. A selector could depend on multiple things. If we have the time today, so I will create a more complicated application after we complete this, where you will see the selector that we will create then would depend on two things. But right now, the selector depends just on one thing, which is count atom. And this is the syntax to create one. You have to give it a name or a key. I would assume it is key. It is a key. You have to give it a key, which I've given the same as the name here. And you have to give it a function inside which you get access to this get function. I repeat, the key is get, which is a function. And the function's argument, if you don't understand this, you can name this to props and do props.get. Either is fine. The function has an argument called get, inside which you pass the atom that this guy derives from. Even selector depends on count, which is why I have to do a props.get count atom. If it would depend on some other state, then I would have to do the same thing here. This is similar to when I was doing a use memo. There was the function and then the dependencies. Rather than passing count as a dependency here, I am doing a props.get code count atom and telling the selector or telling recoil ke bhai, this guy depends on this guy. So whenever this guy changes, make sure you rerun this logic. And then finally returning count modulo 2. Now I can just use this selector just how I was using counter atom, but take 10-15 seconds, write this on your side and maybe try to get comfortable with the syntax. What is the syntax? The key is the same, but rather than you cannot give it a value. It is derived. It by definition depends on something else. So you have to give it a get argument or whatever key, which is a function inside which you write your derivation logic, inside which you write how this guy depends on the other atoms. And since it depends on this one, that's how we're using it. Selectors can depend on other atoms. Selectors can depend on other selectors as well. So if you can write, a lot of logic here, depending on your use case. Iske baad we will create a to-do creation application with filtering logic. I'll explain what this is. This will be same as an assignment from last week, where you will see the selector will depend on two things. It will depend on the to-dos and it will depend on the filter. But let's get there when we get there. If you already understand this very well, feel free to go here. But this is the final thing. How do you define a selector and how do I use it? That's it. Is even, and that's it. Use recoil value even selector, which I'm getting from here, and then finally rendering it based on that. Let's see if that works. Does seem to work. So that's a high level of what a selector is. In recoil, most of your life is going to be inside atoms and selectors. Basically, they're enough to do most things. There is something called selector family, an actor family, atom family, which is needed for some very specific use cases. If you want to understand that, you first need to understand why they are needed. I'm happy to cover that in an offline video or next week if need be. But most applications that you'll be creating here, atoms and selectors are good enough. But what is a good thing to know eventually? Atom family and selector family, which happy to cover later on. That's it. Until this point, we will be building a to-do application after this. But let me do a quick poll and see how we're doing. I can also push in the code if need be. 75%. All right. Let's kick off the doubt session then. And then if we have the time in the end, I'm happy to take a, do the other assignment, but I can just leave it as an assignment for this week as well. So let me push this code in and then open it up for questions. If you understand everything, if you want to, you can build this application. Let me quickly explain what the application is. It is basically an application where you have to have two input boxes, title, description, a button that lets user put a to-do on the state somewhere, and then another input box called filter, which basically lets the user filter all the to-dos. For example, if I write gym inside my filter input box, I should be able to see all my gym to-dos. Basically any to-do that has gym in title or description I should see. And you have to store this also in an atom. You have to store this also in an atom, and you have to create a selector that gives you the current set of to-dos. Basically, given this filter and this set of to-dos, which will also be an atom, given these two, create a selector that is able to select the current set of to-dos that the user should see. If you feel like this was too easy, if you want a challenge, this might be the assignment for this week as well, and maybe something extra, feel free to target this. I think I'm going to pause it here and going to take questions, because 75% is a little low. So let's see what's up. Going to open chat. Right. Code has been pushed. Can we use atom state inside use effect? Yes, you can. You can be like use effect only if is even has changed. Should you do something? So you can do this. Event text. What is that? Please explain selectors and its syntax again. Sure. What I said was, okay, atoms are good enough. Do you need selectors? No. But what do selectors provide you? If you remember the definition, selectors said, okay, bhai, if there is ever something that depends on something else, is derived from something else. For example, count is a state variable, or whatever is an atom in this case. And if you know there is another thing, for example, is even, which purely depends on this. If you remember the definition of recoil that we saw, what did it say? Of selectors that we saw here on the official documentation, it said is a piece of derived state. You can think of a derived state as the output of passing state to a pure function. What does this mean? It means passing state to something that simply uses the state and does something on top of it. It does not have any other state variable, use effect, nothing. If passing a state variable to a simple function, a native function, and getting back a value is what you need, then you should use a selector. Which in this case, in our application, it is even. If the thing that you have depends purely on this, you use a selector. What is the other use case I'm talking about? I am saying create an application where user can see all of their to-dos, and then they have a filter here. Okay, bhai, they will search, they will write gym here, and they should see a subset of this list that only has their gym to-dos, which basically means it has gym in the title or gym in the description. How can you build this? Here also, if you look at it, this filtered to-dos depends purely on two different state variables. The first state variable being to-dos, which is like all the to-dos, and the second state variable being the filter. What is the filter? The thing that is present here. So in this case, you should put this in an atom. You should put the complete list of to-dos also in an atom. And this filtered list of to-dos should ideally be a derived state from this thing and this thing. It depends on this and on this, and it is derived directly from this. Does not have any wajood of its own. Does not have any state variable on its own. It is purely depends on other state variables. That is when you use a selector. How do you define a selector and what is the syntax? This. Just like I defined an atom and gave it two things, a key and a default value. For a selector, you also give it a key, but rather than giving a default value, you cannot give it a value. It is by definition derived. It is by definition dependent on something else. You give it a get key. Okay, bhai, how does recoil get the current value of this selector? And when you define this function, you get access to this get variable here. Okay, bhai, this is how you can get the current set of atoms or selectors. And then यहाँ पे you define the main logic. Bhai, count equal to get, which is this function right here. Again, if this feels weird, props dot get all the things that you derive on, and then finally run whatever mathematical logic you want. This will, how would this look for the filtered to-dos that I'm talking about? It would look something like this. Filtered to-dos props.get to-dos atom const filter equal to props.get filter atom, and then finally I would return to-dos dot filter x either x dot title dot includes filter or x dot description dot includes filter. So this will basically be the assignment that I was talking about. Okay, you will be like, now this selector filtered to-dos depends on two things, this guy and this guy. You will get the values, you will do whatever final computation of how filter to-dos gets derived from these two, and then return it. And that's what a selector is. Hopefully that's slightly clearer. Can we leave? Yeah, feel free to leave. Class is done. Need an offline video on Recoil. Okay, I think I anyways have to create one introducing Atom family, so I can just go from the top there. Can you do a recap of what we taught today? We taught these three things. It was context, state management, and recoil. Context we had done yesterday, I just recapped it. State management, I introduced why is it good to keep state and components separate, and then finally introduced some syntax of recoil, specifically what are atoms and what are selectors and how do you use them. Repeat the use of recoil root. What is the use of recoil root? This thing right here. What is recoil in the end? It is some library that some smart people have written. It is written on top of React. If you want to keep state outside and use it directly in some component, for example, count renderer is using some state variable here. You have to wrap that inside the recoil root. Why, Harkirat? Why doesn't this work? Because under the hood, recoil root also uses either the context API or something else. So it's most probably providing some sort of a provider here. If you really want, we can look at the code of recoil. But if you don't want to look at the code of recoil, then it basically is just how you had to wrap the context API. Whenever you're using the context API, you have to wrap it inside the context provider. Here you have to wrap your application inside recoil root. Why do you need it, Harkirat? Why does it not work without it is a good question, which we will have to look at the code of recoil for to understand why do they make. But this happens everywhere. Any library that you use that is going to provide state across your application. For example, another very common use case is themes. Okay, you a lot of times want the current theme in various components. For example, I would want const is dark equal to use theme, and this will tell me whether or not the dark theme is triggered for the user. Here also you will notice in a bunch of libraries, you have to do like a theme provider at the top and wrap your whole application inside. So whenever you will see libraries that create a shared state and put it throughout your component tree, you will have to wrap that component tree inside a provider. And any any project if you look at, you will see like the app is populated with a bunch of these indentations of 1,000 different providers. If you use a custom hook which returns the custom set state and get state functions, will be optimized. If we use custom hook and which returns I don't understand the question. Can we use atom state and use effect? You can. Selector nahi samajh aaya. Not to mix up things, but are selectors similar to reducers in Redux? What are reducers in Redux? I can answer that later. Let's see. Reducers. Redux. All right. Someone wrote some code. Wrap anyone that wants to use teleported value inside. Okay. So how can you use a simple if else inside a function? Oh, so you can do one of two things. Again, feel free to drop off, guys. It's just going to answer questions here. You can. This is just a function, right? So you can either be like this: if easy is even. Return whatever div you want. It is even. Else return it is odd. So you can do this, or a slightly cleaner syntax is this. Okay, brackets, just write an expression. If is even, then this text else null. This is just another syntax to do conditioning inside a React component. Set count, set still uses the set. If yes, why is it not re-entering? No. So that's the thing. This is using count under the hood, but buttons component, what does the buttons component need to do now? It needs to say, Recoil, please run this function whenever you have the time on the current count. Thank you. This does not need to tell Recoil, your count has been updated to 1. In the previous case, it was telling Recoil, the count has been updated to 1 or 2 or 3. So there it needed access to the count variable. Here, it is just telling Recoil, okay, here is a function. Do you know what count is? Do the math on top of it and figure out what the final value is. I will give you just the function. So this guy does not need access to count. It just needs access to set count. Sure, under the hood, Recoil knows count, and Recoil will, update it however it wants to based on this function. But since buttons does not need count, it will not re-render. Even though, yes, under the hood, Recoil does uses the actual count value. This guy doesn't need to know about the actual value. This guy just needs to tell Recoil this is the function you need to run, and then Recoil runs it. So hence does not re-render. Explain selectors one more time. I think I explained it a few times. I'm happy to explain it again. Use set Recoil state again. How did we do state until now? We said count, set count equal to use state 0. It gave you access to two things. In Recoil also, we are creating a state value, count atom. Depending on what you want, if you want both of them, you can use Recoil state. If you want just count, you can use Recoil value. If you want just the second guy, which is what we want in this case, you can use set Recoil state. Why is this good? Because as we saw, buttons no longer re-renders because I'm not even using count. I'm just using a function that sets the count. I don't need the actual count. I need a function that actually sets the count, which is what this guy gives you. Infinite scrolling and pagination. What about it? A key option is must be provided. I think you have to go through. Oh, you've either not given it a key here. There's some typo here, basically, in your code base, Shruti. Difference between global usage and local usage, like use state when to use and use Recoil state when to use. Yeah. So, okay, let me give an example. Let's say I ask you to create a to-do application. How would you do it? You would be like, Harkirat, this is my to-do application. It returns a div which has an input box, placeholder equal to title, description, and then a button. Add to-do. This is how you would create a to-do application basic. You would also render them below, but let's say we're just worried about how to create the admin panel for a to-do application. If I refresh, it looks something like this. Title, description. Now let's say you want to do something when you click on add to do. How would you do it? You want to actually put something in the state. You would be like, Harkirat, now here is where I have to introduce a state variable. On change equal to set some value e.target.value. Should this value be stored here in a state variable? Title comma set title. Or should it be an atom here? Okay, export const title atom equal to atom, which has a key and whatever value. It should be this. Why, Harkirat? Because okay, this title and description and whatever you're using are going to stay in this component only. You don't need to pass them throughout your application. They're very local. Versus, if you go to any big web, let's say this website, not the LinkedIn or GitHub is a good example for this. Whenever the user is writing something here, this should probably store in use state. But anything else that you see here, all this readme, description, title, should probably be part of state, which means should be an atom. So that's how you can think of when to use state and when to use atoms. Basically, if you put this inside here, it's going to make your store very ugly. The store should really keep the core components of your application, which is like your actual to-dos for a to-do application, and not this local in title and description. So you have to pick and choose basically, and as you create a big application, you will gain the intuition of what to use. I'm able to understand everything, but it all gets mixed up, a bit overwhelming maybe. Is there any project for backend only, or what should I be confident in? Complete the assignment till backend. React I have left. तो यार देखो, can you become a developer without React? Yes. Is only backend enough? Yes. You can skip through all the weeks of React and maybe the next week, because we're going through Tailwind next week. Yeah, you can do that. What can you do in the meanwhile is you can build a lot of backend heavy applications, like basic things like e-commerce application, course selling application you can make. If you want something more, you can basically go through the syllabus of 1 to 100 where some more advanced backend is being covered, and then you can spend some time there. You can use an atom state inside a use effect. Yes. All right. Can we? Okay. Let's do it one more time, guys. Opening chat. All right. I'm not able to join private Discord. Please tell Tuki to reply to me on Discord. Shadev. Please reply to Shadev on Discord. All right, done. Use memo looks good enough and fairly simple. Can you show me use cases that will convince me to use the rather complex selectors? Also, do we need to use Recoil only with React, whereas we can use Redux with other front-end frameworks? Finally, please provide offline videos on selector family and atom family. Okay. First question, use memo looks good enough. If it looks good enough, you can use the only problem with you using a use memo is, what if something depends on is even? We had defined is even as a selector here. You are saying I will not use a selector. I will use it directly here. The problem is, what if there is a third thing? Okay, is even and greater than 10. Then, and let's say this is being used in a completely different component. Then you have all the logic that, dictates if something is even here, and you can't use it in this other selector. So the reason selectors, you might want to move to selectors is because, the derivation might keep on increasing, and then you'll have duplicated logic in multiple places. If you're using a use memo restricts that thing inside a component. Selectors put that thing outside the state. So you can, use it in different places. And especially if something else wants to derive from that thing, it's better to keep it as a selector than use memo. Hope that makes sense. Also, do we need to, okay, so Redux you can use with any library, that is true. You can also use Redux with Node.js for the people who don't know. Can you use Recoil with any library? I would assume yes. Recoil with Node.js. It clearly says state management library for React here versus, Redux is state management library for JavaScript apps, as you can see. So maybe Recoil is just for React and Redux is for everything for sure. But it seems like purely based on this definition here, it's only for React. Like Recoil is only for React. I will put the videos on families. Yes. When will you come to Surat for meetup? Thank you for the wishes, and probably not anytime soon. Surat is probably close to Delhi. I'm assuming. I don't know. Whatever it's. If you want to come, you can come to one of the Delhi or the Bangalore meetups. What if the webhook is a service high level understanding? Oh, webhook as a service. So anything as a service means something else. Let's first have to understand what a webhook is, before you understand what webhook as a service is. A webhook basically is slightly off topic here, but if you have I'll give a basic example here. Razorpay or Stripe, if you've heard of it, are payment applications. And whenever you go to my website, for example, harkiya.classes.co.in, and do a payment, this is my website. This backend call goes to a Razorpay server, and then Razorpay server talks to another bank server, processes the payment, and it's done. And then finally lets me know कि अच्छा हाँ हरकीरत, payment has been done. What is the problem in this approach? Problem with this approach is कि what if you make the payment and close your tab? Then Razorpay knows payment is done, but it tried to tell you back and you have closed the tab. So Razorpay knows the payment is done, but my backend server, the course selling application backend server, does not know the payment is done. How can you solve this problem? This is a very common use case. The other problem is there are a few other reasons why this is a bad idea. Okay, this is the browser, this is Razorpay, and this is my backend server. Why this is a bad idea? Okay, you send the payment, Razorpay tells you payment is done, and then you tell the backend server payment is done. What should happen is the backend server of Razorpay should directly tell me whenever the payment is done, so that even if this guy closes the backend server, my backend servers are always up, Razorpay backend servers are always up. They can directly tell me that something has happened. This is what's called a webhook. Razorpay is hitting my webhook, a place where I'm giving other backend services a way to talk to my database. That payment 1 is done, payment by this user is done, so on and so forth. This is what a webhook is. Webhook as a service basically means some company that's providing this as a service. For example, video API as a service means something like Twilio or Agora that lets you use this thing as a service and you pay directly to the API provider. SMS API as a service, email as a service, and similarly webhook as a service means someone who takes away the pain of writing all of this. Like you become a provider that lets other people create webhooks and define webhooks, things like these. All right, so Razorpay would use your company if you're creating webhook as a service, and so that they don't have to worry about writing all the webhook logic. How to update state by taking input through multiple input elements, and update state when the previous and update the state with previous and current value. How to update state by taking input through multiple input elements and update the state with previous and current value. What does that mean? Update the state with previous and current value matlab? Could you re-ask that question when the chat opens again? Elaborate a little bit more. We'll do those things once again, please. I will write that in an assignment more concretely, but high level it is this. Create an application with filtering logic, a to-do application with filtering logic. To-do application we have created many times. 2 input boxes and a button. You write a title and a description, click on the button, to-do gets added. You need another input box, a filtering input box that will let you filter through your to-dos. Okay, bhai, if you search for gym there, it will show you all your gym to-dos. If you search for food there, it will show you all your food to-dos. So here you have to architect the application in a way where you use 2 atoms, one for to-dos, one for the filter, and a selector which depends on both to-dos and the filter. I will formalize this more when I create the assignment for this week. Difference between use memo and a selector. As I said, right, use memo remains restricted inside your component. Selector comes outside in the state. So other selectors can depend on your selector. If you define something in use memo, no other selector can depend on it. So it will be harder for you to create more and more derived states. How and why we use set. Oh, you cannot use set recoil state selector. Selectors are always derived. It will most probably throw an error. If it does not, also you don't want to use set recoil state on a selector. You cannot set a selector. I am pretty sure it will throw an error when you do that. Correct way to put front-end and back-end folders on GitHub so that we can deploy the project. 2 things you can do: either create separate folders, front-end, back-end, or read about this thing called a mono repo, which is something we are going to discuss very soon, where you can basically contain both the things in the same place. How to update state by taking input through answer that. Correct way to put front-end and answer that. Does Recoil use context under the hood? It's a great question. I was thinking before the class, but it never got to, so basically don't know the answer. We'll check after the class. How to update state by taking input. Don't understand. Webhook ho gaya. And state is never open source, but someone asked a good question. Can you explain why state and components are kept separate and why people would want to open source components and not state? So, if you, yeah, I'll share. If you go to my website, this one, and you try to buy a course, when you click on buy now, you will see this UI come up, right? This is the UI of Razorpay, but it is integrated in my website. So why would they shy away from making this open source? Ye to anyways I'm introducing in my website, and there is no downside for them to open source this. And this has, this card component, this component, pay now button component, pricing component, EMI component, all these things. It makes sense for them to open source all of this. But does it make sense for them to open source what comes when I go to dashboard.razorpay.com whenever I log in? No. They should not open source whatever, state management logic that runs their complete application, but open sourcing this button, or more specifically this is fine. They should open source their design system so that, other people can bring Razorpay elements into their websites. But they shouldn't open source this. You're asking them to open source the whole thing basically. Basically, how can they open source the fancy front-end bits without completely sharing their application with the world? Is if they open source their design system, which is what I meant when I said components you can create and open source. So basically, if I was Razorpay, what would I do? I would, in my count renderer, I would not use this as a selector. I would basically be something like this. This will expect count as an input and render it this way. This I would open source. And then, internally in my company, whenever I write logic, I would use this count renderer and, use the state and actually render the count renderer, pass this variable to it. So whenever you open source, you don't open source any, state management logic. You keep it very generic. Can do something like root reducer and atoms, like how we add reducers. Can you elaborate? Can you write that in a more detailed fashion? The question. Selectors not correct way to answer that. Quick reminder to add to your bucket. Group wise interaction. Post about meetup structure. Meetup structure I don't know about, but group wise interaction we should start ASAP because I want to wrap them up before GSOC. Here, please tell about Java development. Why does everyone talk about one? No idea. I'm getting white screen. Then open the console if you're getting white screen. Hush, and you'll see an error there. Answer that. Why do you answer that? How do you update step by step? Answer that. I am not able to answer that. When to do? I will create. That will be the assignment for this week. How to update state? Answer that. Please tell some of the global repositories to look into for seeing good React projects. Dub.sh is a really good next project. Not really. Now it's very hard to find a good React project, but dub.sh is a good next project. If you know React, you have to learn a little bit more to understand next. But you can start to look at the components at the very least. Lag seems to be worse today compared to yesterday. Okay, let's do a poll. I've just changed the laptop and not the internet. It does not matter, and most probably I'll be in Paris next week. So this is just for when I come back here. Was there a lag? How was the lag today? Was it good? Was it bad? Launching a poll. Why are we repeating code in count.js and count.jsx? If you see the question, please do indicate. Why are we repeating the code? Let me see. Oh, 25% say the lag was unbearable. Okay, let me run a few experiments before next week. Why are we repeating code in count.jsx? Where are we repeating code in count.js? Where do you see repeated code? I don't see any repeated code here. So basically in that get function, we have to access the various atoms and can return the state depends on these atoms by doing some logic. If I'm correct, thank you, Sarji, explained very well. Yes, that is exactly true, and that is a very good explanation that you have put on the screen as well. And if anyone wants to read it, this is the explanation. Oh, I can put it here. There you go. How to update state by answered that. Can you walk us through some open source project in Recoil? Backpack does use Recoil, but it does not use what do you call it? It does not use. It does use React also, but like it uses it as an extension. So if you're trying to set this up locally, your life is going to be a living hell. But if you look at it, Recoil, source, atoms, and it has a few atoms. For example, feature-gates atom, which as you can see, it is not. It is an equal atom, which what it is something we defined to optimize things a little bit more. But think of this as an atom, key, and then the default value. And if you want your default value to be asynchronous, basically you need to do a backend call, or in this case we were hitting the service worker. Then you need to define the default value as a selector, because only selectors can have async gets. You cannot do something like this. Default async function that returns something. If you want the value of an atom to depend on an asynchronous call, for example, if you want to hit a backend, then the default value needs to be a selector, which is what's being done here, and then the selector needs to have a key, and then this is the async function that actually gets it. So this is one atom if you look at it, and if you look at the main code, which is app extension source app.jsx, basically you'll find recoil root here somewhere. Recoil root. This is the one. Here, as I told you, you'll see bunch of things one below the other. This might not be the right one. Let's see. It's most probably not this. I think you'll find in the code base someplace else recoil root as well. And yeah, that's basically the root of the application, and then you can go from there. I think it's somewhere here in source. Index renders what? App. So here, as you can see, the render has like suspense, inside which there is something called secure UI, inside which there is an app. And then if you go to this app, I think you'll find the recoil root as well. ./app/app. There you go. Recoil root. There you go. A router followed by a recoil root. Harkirat, what is a hash router? I said yesterday, React router DOM gives you 10 different ways to do routing. You only need the normal routing in most cases, but if you're creating a Chrome extension, is when you need to use a hash router, which basically means, it takes care of all the routes after a hash. So you're basically on a single route. And then, this hash /a/b/c, everything after this hash is what gets considered as a route. That's what an extension should use, and then the final recoil route. So inside the application, you will see a bunch of use atoms, use recoil state, use recoil value. And here we took the conscious decision, in the store, we initially, if you look at it, had as I said, to keep it generic. For the longest time, we thought, we'll keep it generic. So if we have to move over to Redux, we can. So everything was defined as a hook. Initially, the expectation was only hooks will be exported, nothing else will be exported from here. So that if you ever want to switch to recoil, we'll just make the changes here, and the main application is not affected. But then eventually it was very hard to maintain it, and so the application now uses recoil. But initially we thought, the app extension, the main extension, will not even have recoil or use recoil state as dependencies ever. This recoil folder would, but our main application will only use the hooks here. So they will only import this recoil library and use the hooks directly. I don't know if you understand this very well, or if I'm explaining this very well, but basically the idea was initially there was the same fight. Should use recoil, Redux, what? We finally arrived at recoil, and then we said, if this is your main website code, React code, there is another module called Recoil, and this will expose only hooks, their own hooks. Use user, use set user, use to do's, use set to do, so on and so forth. React will use this only. This React app will not have Recoil as a dependency. This Recoil app will have Recoil as a dependency, or more probably we should call it a store app. And then if we ever want to move, we will remove all the Recoil logic here. We will add all the Redux logic here. And then the end app will not change basically. The end app can always, since it did not have Recoil as a dependency to begin with, it does not change at all. Only this store application will change if you want to, switch Recoil from Redux. So yeah, it's a high level. Piछले cohort में we used to do this a lot, by the way, like open source projects and try to find something that we learned. We're not doing it much in this cohort because a lot of beginners in this one, and 0 to 1, and very easy to get overwhelmed. But all right. Not related to today's class, some doubts about GSOC 2024. I am facing a problems in finding issues for contributions. Most beginner issues are already have a linked PR. Anyways, does not matter. You don't get any outsized outcomes if you solve a beginner issue. And I tried solving one in P5JS web editor issue and spent almost 4 hours, but not able to find any solution. Snake game problem. Most of the GSOC organizations are using TypeScript, and अच्छा, that is why तुम लोग TypeScript कर रहे हो क्या? Okay, let me upload the TypeScript videos. If you go through both the TypeScript videos, half of it is already on YouTube in a preview video. I'll upload the complete video on TypeScript today or give you guys access. Those 2 videos are enough to understand TypeScript. That makes sense as to why so many people are asking for TypeScript suddenly. Is GSOC 2024 still possible? Most people start in January only. It's January 15th only. Keep a lookout on the organizations now. Whenever they come, find one that was not present earlier and has been introduced this year, or has been stale for a few years, so that no one has contributed to it. Even if that's not, don't contribute to processing anymore. वो भर गया फिर से. Which is why I'm going to bundle a few organization code setups together and then put them together so we don't spam an organization. So don't do processing anyways. It's anyways, if your goal is getting GSOC, it's anyways pretty full. Find a different one. And to your question around कि I spent 4 hours and not able to fix it, uska I don't have a good solution, unfortunately. Basically there's a knowledge gap. You don't know the project enough, or you don't know the stack enough. You have to figure out what. If you don't know the project enough, you will eventually. If you don't know the stack enough, you have to, spend some time learning first. How to update state by taking in answered that. Can you custom hooks? You will up today. रहने दो भाई 9 बज गए. But I will create. I have it this week. I will create a offline video on advanced recoil and custom hooks. ठीक है? And the assignment for this week. Can recoil and context coexist? They can. Is there any issue, any use case in the real project where we are using both? Yes. In fact, here, if you look at it, we have recoil, and this also, I'm almost 100% certain we have context in a few places. So if you want, why would you do this, Akirat? So there are 3 extremes. One is your global things for which you need recoil. What are global things? On LinkedIn, it will be your posts, your feed, all these things. Your completely local things, for example, the input box that I kept on talking about, if you create something like this state remains here itself. There is a third case where, there are 2-3 components in which some state needs to be shared. And it does not make sense to store it in recoil. A good example here is in Backpack. Backpack is an extension, wallet. So what makes sense to be stored in recoil? Your balances, your dollar balances, your amount, how much Solana you have, how much ETH you have, things like this. Then I added chat to it. Chat logic did not make sense to write in the shove in the recoil store, but at the same time, it needed to be propagated across various components. So there I used the context API. Somewhere here you will find the chat SDK, where you will see that wahan pe we have been using the context API, because otherwise it would have led to a lot of prop drilling. Frankly, there's still a lot of prop drilling there. If still part here, if you still find it here. But how do you get rid of prop drilling there? Is by using the context API. So that's what I added. That's the use case of when you use context with this thing. Also, can you explain the term derived state with an example in layman terms? Yes. You are derived state. बताता हूँ. You have a car and I come to you and ask, is this car functioning? Does this car run? Can I take this car out today? What will you do? You will go to the car and check how much petrol it has. You will check the ignition. You will check the brake oil. You will check 10 different things, right? I just came and asked you one question. Does this car run? You don't know this from the top of your head. It is derived from 10 different inputs. It depends on, does the car have petrol? Does the car have brake oil? Does the car have engine? Does the car have 10 different things, right? So this is a derived state. Me asking one question and the answer of that question depending on 10 different state variables via some logic. What is the logic here? Petrol should be more than 2 liters. Brake oil should be more than 5 liters. Ignition should be able to start the car, so on and so forth. So this is what a derived state is. One thing, I ask one question, depends on 10 different things. For example, here, whether or not something is even depends on that number. Might seem a little weird because this is a very simple derived state. Depends on one input, but as this becomes 5 inputs is when you can see the benefits. Open chat for just 2 seconds. We get questions small chunks and the spamming will be managed by these. If chat's open 5 plus 6 plus, same question. Yeah. But yeah, please tell about Java development. I don't know about Java development. Is it even? Basically, it gets function. We have access to various atoms and can return the state depending on these atoms. Logic, if I'm correct. Thank you. Okay, answer that. How to update state? Answer that. I remember the term Ajax being used a lot. Is there any relation to re-rendering in React and Ajax? Completely separate things. It's like the difference between Java and a puppy. Should we worry about extra lines of? So I get it. Ajax and JSX are completely separate. Just sound similar. Should we worry about extra lines of code that these libraries like Recoil bring to make the client heavier? Yeah, you should, but no one does. It's like very minuscule compared to React's fine. Is Recoil be used in Next.js as well? You can use Recoil in Next.js as well. State management in Next is when your brain will go basically break, because Next 13 now even React introduced something called server components, which when we get there we will get there, but basically state management has become a whole extremely painful in the newer fancier versions of Next. Answered that. How to update? Answered that. Kirat Bhai, can you explain why component and state are kept? Answered that. Same set of questions again, it seems. How to update state by taking input through multiple. ये तो मुझे समझ नहीं आया था. ये भी मुझे समझ नहीं आया. All right. Cool guys. Last set of questions and then I'll call it. Open chat. All right. Stop chat. Companies choose on whatever the developer in that company has the experience and just goes with it. I don't know if there are good metrics people think of, if I'm being honest. Oh, we are starting a new this thing. Let's choose between one library or another. People just run with it. SVX is a web hook as a service. It basically helps sites like Clerk make their clients access. Makes sense. It is used to do post requests. Well, that's my understanding. Yeah, that makes sense. Clerk is also one such application that needs webhooks very, aggressively. And you said SVix. What is that? Copy. Webhook as a service, right? It makes sense. Webhooks are not very hard, but at the same time, you have to take care of things like, if a webhook fails, you have to resend it, give the user a dashboard to resend it, things like these. I can totally see this becoming like it's like backend as a service. Is it hard to write like Node.js code? No. But it is for some people. So for them, people have created a simple way to, run backend as a service. Similarly, webhook as a service. Makes sense. Why did you share this though? Are they open source? They probably have SDKs which are open source. So, complete thing is open source. Probably just the APIs are open source. Yeah, these are just like language specific APIs, I'm assuming. All right. Do organizations raise up open source code just for branding and consistency? Yeah, I don't know. Probably. Yeah, I mean, Stripe Razor पे के लिए तो ये है कि यार they really want people to bring their button into their UI and so that they have some whatever gives them brand, puts their name everywhere. So yeah, probably that. I am getting widescreen, nothing in the console. If you're getting a widescreen and nothing in the console, you have either not returned anything in one of these components. You're basically doing this. If you are having that clear your code completely. Just go to app and return a simple div which returns high. Start here. If you see high is when you incrementally add other components and then see where it breaks. Can you please do a poll for using light theme? For using light theme? What do you mean? I cannot use light theme in my editor if that's what you want. Why do selectors? Okay. Why do we use selectors? Can you please explain once again its main use? Let me put that in an offline video. Or yeah, I'm going to do full recoil again. Understand the limitations, but can you rethink about Mumbai meet? Mumbai, Bangalore, and Delhi will happen. The question is, Mumbai to chalo can happen at once. Delhi will probably happen in chunks, which basically means it'll be more like an office hours. Is what I'm thinking right now. Okay, I rent an office for a week, and then you guys can register in chunks. Okay, I will come on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then 300 people, 100 people come in smaller chunks, and we actually verify people from the cohort. Versus if we do a public open meetup, it's very hard to manage. You need police, you need 10 different things, and everyone will come, not just cohort people. So that's what I'm trying to think right now. That is the other option. I'm not saying we're not doing a very big theatrical meetup. I'm saying I'm leaning towards a leaner, smaller, closer group. Let's meet and do some office hours versus Sultan playing in the background and me going on stage. I don't love that. You understand the limitation, but answer that. How does one know recoil set count? How does recoil know that set count will update the count like you state? How does recoil know? Recoil is a library that's written for that, right? Whoever wrote the code has. I don't think I understand your question. In Redux, can we persist value by thunk and persist? How can you do the same here? I will have to read about this. I don't know Redux itna well. In Redux, can persist values using thunk and persist? How can you do? Acha, you basically mean how can you persist value in local storage or something like that? Let's see. Thunk and persist in Redux. What do you mean persist? Like put it in local storage or something? Yeah, probably put it in. Yeah, makes sense. There is a project, Recoil. I'm sure it will be called something like this only. Persist in local storage. Let's see. There you go. There's a project called Recoil Persist, which I'm assuming tiny module Recoil to store sync stage to storage. It only stores this much. Yeah, basically this. So I'm sure there's someone who's tried to create a similar thing for Recoil, which probably this seems like one such project. When will you upload the previous two assignment solutions? When I get the time. The assignment solutions. So basically week 4 and 5, right? Let me see. If not me, then I'll ask Laisha or someone else to do it, but I'll try to do it myself. Can you use state in atoms or get it in selector? Can you use React use state inside atom? No, don't do that. Even if you can, don't do that. Or inside selector, no, don't do that. No. Now that I think of it, probably not. No, I haven't seen it. But my memory tells me I've seen it somewhere. Probably not. Definitely not in a selector. Selector is purely derived. One should be derived from other recoil atoms or selectors. Atom may be no. I know. Most probably no. Can you use answer that? Why do you use selector? Can you please explain? Let me get an offline video. Recoil root again. Lag was too bad. It'll be in the video. Go there. Else I'll also creating a video again. Yeah, state age derived state is adult if age is greater than 100. That's a good example. If a state variable is age, is adult is a state variable or is a derived can be derived from the age state variable. All right. Let's call it here, guys. Thank you for joining. Video will be uploaded soon. I have a few to-dos for this week. You do too. You should start getting very comfortable with React. We just have one more week of styling in React left and then back to backend. And this is the point after which all the difficult things are done. Iske baad React is the most difficult thing. Wo ho gaya. Everything else pretty straightforward after this. So would urge you to make sure you don't drop off here, because if you don't drop off here, you will not drop off after this. After this, there is no big, plateau that is left. And also, even if there are big plateaus, you can ignore them. For example, if you're doing the open API spec, even if you don't understand it, it's fine. At least you can still build a full stack application. So make sure you're sticking through React and, not dropping off here. With that, let's end it. I will see you guys in the next one, or next week basically. Bye bye. Good night.